I looked down the street, both directions. It was getting dark, getting cold, and I got in the van and I hit a bunch of corners. I went down this street. I turned my light on. I searched. I called their names. Talked to a gentleman on the street on the other side over there. He didn't see anyone.
So he left at 16:33 and he's back by 16:38.
How fast he's coming back? He's punching it, bro.
Yeah, he's moving.
Look at that.
For people who are thinking that there's some kind of foul play involved, we just spoke to the biological mother. She says she had a conversation with you guys, and that she thinks there's some kind of foul play involved, that she thinks you guys did something.
And that's understandable.
What's your response to that?
That's understandable. I would think the same thing.
Yep.
The community is scared, confused, and angry, and so is the biological mother of both boys.
I don't understand.
Where are they?
Ultimately, the answer to the question of where are the boys will be answered. It's that they're dead. And at the end of the case, I will ask you to return a verdict of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt as to Trezell and Jacqueline for the murders of Orrin and Orson West.
A grand jury indicted the West, the adopted parents of Orrin and Orson, in March 2022. Their attorneys have said the couple had nothing to do with the boys' disappearance. The bodies of Orrin and Orson have not been found.
One of the most highly anticipated trials in Kern County in recent years. A jury was chosen last week for the trial of Trezell and Jacqueline West. The California City couple is charged with murders of their adopted sons, Orrin and Orson, who were reported missing more than 2 years ago. The bodies of the boys have not been found. One of the things that's very interesting, though, the boys are still missing. There are no bodies. Yet these parents are charged with involuntary manslaughter and second-degree murder. How is this possible if there are no bodies?
That's one thing that was asked of District Attorney Cynthia Zimmer when the charges were first announced. And she said she could recall 2 cases off the top of her head where there were no bodies in Kern County, but the DA was able to get secure murder convictions in those cases. So it is possible. It is a lot more difficult, though. Typically, in a murder trial, I think Eric Smith said during jury selection last week, he told potential jurors, 99.9% of jury trials, there's a body. You're going to see autopsy photos. You're going to hear from a pathologist talking about how the person died. In this case, you're not going to have that. So it's going to be interesting to see what evidence the prosecution has pointing to the fact that someone was killed and that the Wests were responsible. They have a lot to prove here regarding that, since the boys have not been found.
Involuntary manslaughter to second-degrry murder. Both. Why both?
Most serious charge is the second-degree murder charge. That carries a penalty of 15 years to life. In that case, that's the example I've heard most often is shooting into a crowded room. It's a reckless disregard for human life. You may not mean to kill somebody, but it's so reckless that you can be charged with murder if someone dies as a result. The involuntary manslaughter is the unintentional killing of someone else. 4 years is the maximum you can face with that. As to why they filed both, I'm not sure. It may be that the evidence doesn't support second degree. They go with the involuntary manslaughter instead. In California, it's 7 years a person is presumed dead if they haven't been heard from. In this case, they filed charges just after about a year and a half, I believe it was. And I think part of that is because the boys are so young. Mm-hmm. They're clearly not traveling anywhere. Right. Either. One thing that Timothy Hennessy, one of the defense attorneys for Trezell West, said is that, one, their clients didn't do it, but also he said the boys may still be alive, just missing. Someone may have taken them. So we'll find out more about what he has to say during his opening statement, too.
Because that is what the West said when they initially reported the boys missing. They said they ran away. They got out of the back fence.
That's correct. The father said he was gathering firewood. It was December 2020. He was outside gathering firewood. The boys were outside playing together. He said he went in briefly to drop off the firewood, came back out, and they were gone.
However, the interesting thing in this case is these were not the West's only children. They have multiple other, both adopted and biological children, and they're expected to be involved in the trial, right?
That's right. The Wests have 2 biological children and 2 other adopted children, and at least some or maybe all of them will be called to testify. I believe the oldest is now 13 and the youngest 6. And during jury selection, the defense attorneys did ask potential jurors. They said, we want you to keep in mind that, yes, there will be children testifying. There's probably going to be some emotional testimony, some tears, right. But don't let that sway you. Just listen to what they say. And also to be cognizant of the fact that sometimes children say things to please adults. kind of suggesting to the jury that they may be wanting to please the investigators, and it may not be exactly what happened. But they just told them basically keep an open mind and examine their testimony as you would anyone else.
The West were a family of 8 with 4 adopted children and 2 biological children. Smith told the jury that the West's primary source of income was the $4,000 total a month made from each child they adopted. Smith said the boys are dead and they didn't die at the same time.
Orson was in California City for about 4 days. At some point, Adrian heard a loud thud in the night. The day prior to hearing the thud, Orson was there. The day after the loud thud, Orson was gone and he hasn't seen him since.
Defense attorney Timothy Hennessy says this is still a missing persons case and that the West want answers as to where their children are, as any parents would.
This was a tragic accident, is what the evidence will show. All right? They don't have an answer for it because it was tragic. But instead, Trezell is here on a murder charge.
Hennessy said there are inconsistencies in the investigation and that evidence will show the couple's innocence.
Cal City out the gate just never thought anyone would take 2 little black boys. That's why the investigation will look the way it did.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Trezell West. This is Jacqueline West. And their 2 sons are missing. Their sons, Orrin and Orson, are missing. We're here because it's easier to charge them than for them to explain why they couldn't find them.
This is the last known photo ever taken of Orrin. Recovered from the cell phones that were seized in this case. This is the last known photo of Orson, taken in the apartment at Lotus Lane, July 25th, 2020. Now, during one of the interviews, and it'll be played for you here, Jacqueline West talks about how she talked to her kids about Orrin and Orson. She said, I told them, pretend they're not here. Just act like they don't live here. Just go do your work. She talked about what she did with Orrin and Orson. I always keep them separated. I keep them separated.
Weird.
I focus mainly on schooling while they're playing. They don't really play together, but they have played together. I just don't know. But that's essentially what happened to Orrin and Orson. They were in that home, but they were kept separate. And then ultimately, sometime in September, they were killed and have not been seen since then. Not only were they not in the van on December 19th, that they hadn't been in the home in California City also.
As testimony and body camera footage was played from the night the boys were reported missing, officers questioned that the boys had left through the backyard as the couple claimed.
Their bodies have never been found. Have never been found. Even with the attempts of the California City Police Department, the Bakersfield Police Department, the FBI.
The prosecution also stating that the West's other children all claimed the boys were gone long before that night, and that neighbors claimed to have never seen one or both of them.
For weeks, that all 4 will be called to testify, including the eldest child who said he witnessed Orrin turn pale and die one night when the family still lived in Bakersfield before moving to California City.
Officer Brian Hansen testified that he became suspicious shortly after responding to the West home for a report of 2 missing children. This was in December of 2020. Hansen said he checked the backyard where the West said Orrin and Orson had been playing, but saw no footprints made by a child's shoe. This is not a normal situation, Hansen said into his body-worn camera video that was playing in court this morning. These kids didn't just walk away, he said. The biggest revelation in this case so far came from the prosecution yesterday. Prosecutor Eric Smith telling the jury one of West's other children said he witnessed one of the boys die and said the other later disappeared after a thud was heard one night. Although the boys' bodies have not been found, the prosecution has said that evidence, including interviews with the West's other children, indicates the boys were killed in September of 2020, 3 months before the West reported them missing. The West are charged with second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and other offenses and face life terms in prison if convicted.
May 11th, 2023, the 21st day of the trial of Jacqueline and Trezell West. The Wests are charged with murder and other offenses in the boys' death. Orrin and Orson, also known as Classic and Sincere. The boys' bodies have not been found. The Wests said the boys, 2 of their 4 adopted children, disappeared while playing outside on the evening of December 21st, 2020. Judge Charles R. Brimmer is about to read the jury instructions in the case of Jacqueline and Trezell West. First, he's telling the jury the dates of sunrise and sunset on certain dates in September 2020, the month in which prosecutors say Orrin 4 and Orson 3 died. Brimmer is reading the instructions. It's expected to take about an hour. He said some of the instructions may not apply depending on their findings in the case. He told them not to do any research or investigate the facts of the law regarding this case. The jury must separately consider the evidence and each charge against each defendant separately. Both Trezell and Jacqueline West are charged with the 7 same crimes. For counts 1 through 6, the crimes allegedly took place in September 2020, and count 7 on December 21st, 2020. Brimmer said the fact that the charges have been filed does not mean the defendants are guilty. They are presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge said, evidence is the sworn testimony of witnesses, exhibits presented during the trial, and anything else he specifically identified as evidence. Nothing the attorneys say is evidence. Any testimony stricken from the record must be ignored, Brimmer said. Anything the jurors heard outside the courtroom also must be ignored. Facts can be proved by direct or circumstantial evidence. Both are equally valid. Circumstantial evidence is evidence of another fact or group of facts from which you can conclude the truth of the fact in question, Brimmer said. If 2 or more reasonable conclusions can be drawn from circumstantial evidence, and one points to innocence and the other to guilt, the jury must choose the one that points to innocence, Brimmer said. With witnesses, the jury must consider whether the witness knows someone in the case and has a certain bias, and whether they made inconsistent statements. The testimony of only one witness can prove any fact, Brimmer said. But before determining that, the jury should review all evidence. Both the prosecution, defense, and law enforcement must disclose their evidence at a specified time before the trial. 2 Cal City officers had contact with a man in Cal City who had video surveillance, but didn't take notes or use their body cameras to record this contact. The officers did not seize, obtain, or ask for the surveillance footage from the man. It wasn't until the testimony of one of the officers that anyone else became aware of the existence of the video. Because of this, the defense couldn't view it. The jury can take that into consideration. The jury can use statements witnesses made before trial to determine if what they said in court was true. This includes children 10 and younger who testified at trial. You should not discount or distrust the testimony of a witness just because he or she is a child. A defendant has an absolute constitutional right not to testify, Brimmer said, telling the jury not to consider for any reason the fact that the defendants did not testify. That is not allowed to influence their decision. If the West made false or misleading statements before trial, that can't prove guilt by itself. There has been evidence presented of uncharged crimes, child abuse, and that can be considered along with the other evidence. The evidence of the uncharged crimes can't be used by itself to determine guilt of charged crimes, Brimmer said. A defendant is not responsible for any acts before he or she joined a conspiracy, Brimmer said. The defendants are charged with both murder and manslaughter. Brimmer is explaining the differences. To prove they are guilty of murder, prosecution must prove they committed an act that caused the death of another person, or they had a duty to act to prevent the death of Orrin West, Brimmer said. A parent has a legal duty to help or care for their minor child, Brimmer said. Among the allegations is that an unknown co-conspirator killed Orson West on September 17, 2020. A separate decision must be made as to whether each defendant was part of a conspiracy, Brimmer said. For count 2, involuntary manslaughter, Brimmer said that the crime occurs when a person commits an unlawful killing but does not intend to kill. The Wests are being charged with 2 counts of child abuse likely to result in death or great bodily harm. 1 count for Orrin the other for Orson. The judge has finished reading the instructions. The judge said police and law enforcement reports are not in evidence. The jury, when deliberating, can request testimony about those reports, not the reports themselves. Closing arguments are scheduled 9 a.m. Tuesday. For anyone who missed it, I'm going to go ahead and replay a lawyer's version of what it really means to find someone guilty or innocent in the court of law, of the presumption of innocence, of reasonable doubt, and such. The bottom line is that the prosecutors in any case, whether it be a misdemeanor or a felony, have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, trying to figure out exactly what that means is not always easy. There's a jury instruction. It basically says, the judge tells the jury, I will now explain the presumption of innocence and the people's burden of proof. The defendant has pleaded not guilty to the charges. The fact that a criminal charge has been filed against the defendant is not evidence that a crime is true. You must not be biased against the defendant just because he or she has been arrested, charged with a crime, or brought to trial. This is the start of the explanation of beyond a reasonable doubt, because it talks about that when the trial starts, a defendant has a presumption of innocence, meaning that they're presumed innocent. So if the jury had to vote right then, they'd have to vote not guilty. Burden of proof. It also says the people have the burden of proof. That means whoever is prosecuting the case, whether they be the district attorney, the city attorney, in a federal case, the assistant United States attorney, they must prove the case. And if they don't prove the case, then there's not any type of guilty verdict. Because if they haven't proved all of the elements of what they've charged the client with, it's not a guilty verdict. Just because somebody is charged doesn't mean they're guilty. Just because somebody is charged, you shouldn't be looking at the person in a negative light. You should keep an open mind, listen to the evidence, and if the prosecutors can't prove their case, then you should find the defendant not guilty. Presumption of innocence. The instruction goes on by the judge to the jury, and it says, a defendant in a criminal case is presumed to be innocent. This presumption requires that the people prove a defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. This is where it starts to become very nebulous and confusing because they just keep mentioning the term reasonable doubt over and over again. I think what it really boils down to is a jury is going to listen to the evidence, and if they don't feel that this person should be convicted of this particular crime, they're going to find him not guilty. There are some other terms that they use, but they just keep saying beyond a reasonable doubt and presumption of innocence over and over again, thinking somehow that's going to explain exactly what the standard is and what the prosecutors have to prove and to what degree do they have to prove it. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So the instruction goes on. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you with an abiding conviction that the charge is true. The evidence need not eliminate all possible doubt because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. So they go back and forth. One side for the defense, one side for the prosecution. When they look back 10 years from now, they're going to have to say, okay, I feel confident that the person is guilty if that's their finding. But if they can't do that, if they're not sure, if they don't think the prosecution has put all the evidence on, then it's not a guilty verdict, period. They should do that very quickly and very easily because of the presumption of innocence. The last thing the judge reads to the jury in a criminal case when they're talking about the whole concept of beyond a reasonable doubt is in deciding whether the people have proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt, you must impartially compare and consider all of the evidence that was received throughout the entire trial. Unless the evidence proves the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, they are entitled to an acquittal, and you must find them not guilty. And as confusing as that may all still be, the people are just going to have to listen to the evidence, get a feel for it, and then make an informed decision about whether or not the prosecutors have brought enough evidence so they feel comfortable finding the defendant guilty. Or if they feel the defense has put on a very strong argument, They feel confident finding the defendant not guilty. If the verdict is guilty, the judge determines the defendant's sentence. If a defendant is found not guilty, the defendant is released and the government may not appeal. The person may not be charged again for the same offense in a federal court. The Constitution prohibits double jeopardy or being tried twice for the same offense. Just wanted you guys to know where we are in this thing, where we really are in this thing legally.